Power Breakfast. Top talk of the morning.
The time now is 7:15. You're on Power Breakfast with Tessa Dooms. Immigration is one of the hot topics in South Africa, and has increasingly in the last 5 years or so been something that always elicits strong opinion. So I ask you to buckle up for this one and just think about this conversation with a fair amount of nuance. Because when I thought about this, and this is a conversation about how do you protect vulnerable legitimate refugees or asylum seekers as you try and fix border control, the question that came to mind for me is, where would South Africans go if our country actually became ungovernable or the governance completely broke down? Where would we go? What would happen? And there's some of us who can say, I'll book my ticket too, but that's not the majority of South Africans. Where actually would we go if things actually got properly lit in this country and we found ourselves in a civil war? I think that must be in the back of our mind as we have these kinds of conversations. With us this morning is Professor Loren Landau, the co-director of the Wits-Oxford Mobility Governance Lab at the University of the Witwatersrand, because they've raised some issues with the South Africa One-Stop Border Post Bill that is going through the process now, saying that they think that it needs to have a lot more protections for vulnerable immigrants. Dr. Landau, Professor Landau, thank you so much for joining us this morning. What is the view that you are putting forward when it comes to this bill and the protection of immigrant rights?
Good morning, and good morning to your listeners. I think what we're seeing with this bill is some very good things, an effort to try to facilitate trade and movements across the border in an orderly way, which has been an issue. But I think what we're looking at is a system that is part of a broader effort, which is really to stop people coming into the country, whatever the reason. And as you say, it is the government's right to try to stop people who are coming in without documents, etc., unless they are seeking asylum. And unless perhaps they have legal rights to be here, but simply can't get their documents in order because, well, home affairs, right? Or because of the legal frameworks make it impossible for them to do so. And that's where we run into problems. If you have strong border enforcement, people will get stuck at the border. Chances are they'll end up with more corruption, more sort of irregularity, more exploitation at the border, and more smuggling, if we manage to strengthen things along the roads.
So before we get into what the consequence of strengthening is in terms of corruption, I wanted to zero in on a point that you were making about not having documents because of our own home affairs processes and systems. I have found, speaking to people who find themselves stuck in South Africa, I've seen it with a number of different kinds of cases, either people who've been here for a long time and then the processing of their documents takes a long time, or they lose documents. Things can get really messy. What does the bill help us with in terms of regularizing people who legitimately came in legally, but then found themselves trapped in inefficient home affairs processes?
Right. Well, the bill about the border that talks about border control doesn't really address any of these issues about what you do with people coming in or already in the country. That's a broader immigration, citizenship, other laws. We continue to have these debates over what was initially called the Zimbabwean exemption permit. These are people who have been here now for 10, 15 years and have children who may be born in South Africa, but because of the law, don't have a right to South African citizenship. If they're from Zim, probably can't get their documents there. So we've created this whole class of sort of stateless children. These are things that we need to address beyond what's happening at the borders.
All right. And so then going back to the border management issue itself, so you're saying that as we get stricter border controls, which we absolutely need, porous borders is not a good thing, that we're running the risk of heightening corruption. But surely we can't say, we shouldn't have stricter border control because it might heighten corruption. There has to be a remedy for the corruption end of that. Does the bill have any scope for how we deal with the corruption more effectively? And is there anything from your side that you think we can introduce, or any recommendations you'll be making in this process around how you make sure that corruption that may be be heightened as we have stricter measures can be combated?
Right. I think we need to start from a position that border control is important. It's an important way of it's for revenue collection, it's for security, etc. But stricter doesn't mean stronger. And what we need is stronger border controls that can help protect South Africans economically, and we need and of course from criminal activity. And what we've done instead is try to put the military there without a framework that actually allows legitimate people to move easily in and out of the country, as we would all, in ways that would benefit all of us. And as such, if you create a force, a policing of something that is basically impractical, people will find their way around it. And so that is part of the problem, and that's what's been happening for many years. But I think one of the things we do see in the bill, and hopefully would work, which is in line with what the Border Management Agency has been trying to do, is to recognize that there is corruption, there are problems within the police, the military, whoever else it is that is at the border, and those also need oversight mechanisms. We need to be able to see what's going on and to challenge it if there are issues.
So, Prof, just two things on that one. You make a distinction between stricter and stronger, and I'd really like you to give us a practical example of the difference between stricter and stronger, because, it has to be a substantive difference. But you also talk about taking a policing approach to what's happening at the border, or a military approach to what's happening at the border. What is the alternative to having a policing or border approach? Because for the majority of people in the country, that's the thing that makes people feel like something is happening, because they see the way in which this conversation is couched is that you're coming into the country illegally. So there's a criminalization of that moment that seems to require a policing response. What's the alternative to a policing response or a military response?
Yeah, I mean, what we also need, in addition to police and others, is a level of pragmatism. And if we look at what the European Union has done, we look at what the United States has done on its borders, the more military, the more police that you put there, the more corruption, the more human rights abuses, the more exploitation you get. What you don't really see is a big decrease in the number of people crossing the borders, right? And so you need something that is going to work. If our goal is to try to stop people from coming in and taking jobs or coming in and committing crime, yes, we can try to address that at the border, but we can also complement that, which is something that we have not been doing, with inspections at workplaces, with holding employers accountable for hiring people, because people can't work if they don't have an employer, and those people can be held responsible. If it's criminality we're worried about, what about investigations into crime, into smuggling rings, etc., that can address the people who are smuggling, but not the person who's trying to come back into town to see their family, or is trying to move across the border to try to sell something small and make some money to support their family elsewhere. So I think we need a more nuanced approach, but one that is rooted in pragmatism, not just in this kind of performance of, yes, let's put the military, we'll put tanks on the border, we'll put whatever it is, because it's not clear that that is actually going to solve a problem, except for politicians, because as you say, it shows that they're doing something, but it may not be that they're actually doing what they say it's going to accomplish.
Would one of those more pragmatic approaches be around, for example, the visa regimes, right? So we know that SADC has got a 90-day visa on arrival policy. Is that something that needs to be re-looked at? Is that something that could be administratively done differently on our side, so that we make sure that, number one, it is not something that is used improperly? And I mean by improperly in terms of people intending to stay for longer, who just use the 90 days to access, but then actually overstay and stay for longer. Is there a way to use that, or to rethink how administratively you work on that, in terms of, for example, scanning, being able to do assessments of people? I don't know. I'm just trying to think about at the moment of the border, because some of the things you're mentioning are things that happen after somebody's already inside. So what do we do at the border differently administratively to bring in the nuance you're talking about?
Right. I mean, as you say, border control can only be effective if you have a policy framework that is fit to purpose. And South Africa hasn't had that since the mid-1990s, when it did open up to the region. And there were these initial efforts across SADC to try to ease movement. South Africa was uncomfortable with that and has made bilateral agreements with Zimbabwe, with Mozambique, with other countries. But it does make it more complicated, and it makes it more difficult to know whether someone is moving legally or illegally. It's also difficult, of course, because many of our neighboring countries don't issue documents regularly. People don't have the IDs they would need to even prove that they're a static resident. And so that puts the burden on South Africa to try to recognize that. But I think you're right. We can do things at the border, but we also have to recognize that the border crossings, the official border crossings, are only a small part of the border mechanism or the broader complex. People are crossing in lots of different ways. Yeah. There are many ways into South Africa. And so you can't fix everything just by, at Bay Bridge putting up a new border post. We need to think about this as a broader sort of complex of policy, of policing, and of enforcement and regulation within South Africa as well.
Yeah, I think this is a complex conversation, and actually, the longer we have the conversation, the more I realize that we're going to have to get into the nitty-gritties of each of the policy pinpoints in terms of how we, for example, assess who's a refugee, who's an asylum seeker. Maybe it's those kinds of administrative systems that need to be a better part of the border security process. But a lot to think about there, and thank you so much, Professor Loren Landau, for giving us those provocations to think about. We will come back to this, but that was Professor Loren Landau, co-director of the Wits-Oxford Mobility Governance Lab at the University of the Witwatersrand.